Vladimir Putin has invited Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to visit Russia next year, saying that it would give them an opportunity to discuss all current issues and also talk about the outlook for the development of bilateral relations between India and, of course, Russia.
Now, the Russian president hailed the growth in trade turnover with India as he met with New Delhi's foreign minister on Wednesday.
Speaking during the meeting with S. Jaishankar in Moscow, India's external affairs minister, Putin, the Russian president, said the growth in the volume of trade between the two nations, India and Russia, over the last 9 months had already exceeded the entire growth of last year. The Indian foreign minister also highlighted the progress in trade, stating turnover had exceeded $50 billion. During the talks, Putin also said he would inform India's top diplomat about the situation in Ukraine.
I know Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's desire to do everything to resolve the conflict in Ukraine through peaceful means. Now, we will discuss this in more detail and inform you further. I know that my colleagues have probably already talked about this. However, we will further inform you about the situation.
Jaishankar meanwhile confirmed that the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi planned to visit Russia next year. He also said an agreement was signed between the two countries in the nuclear sector, which would take the nuclear power project forward. Construction of the first two units began nearly 2 decades ago as part of a project signed by both the countries.
Certainly, Mr. President, he looks forward to visiting Russia next year, and I'm sure that we will find a date which is mutually convenient from the political calendar of both countries. So it is certainly something that he looks forward to.
Earlier in Moscow, the Indian foreign minister met his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. The Russian foreign minister described India and Russia as reliable partners. Jaishankar said the relationship between the two countries was strong and steady. He added there have been frequent meetings between Moscow and New Delhi officials this year, including interactions at international platforms such as the G20, the SCO, ASEAN and BRICS.
Importantly, Russia and India held discussions over joint weapons production. Lavrov said both nations had made concrete moves forward in this area and stressed the cooperation was strategic in nature.
We discussed the prospects for military technical cooperation, including the joint production of modern types of weapons. Here too, there are concrete moves forward. Our interaction in this direction is also strategic in nature. Its deepening corresponds to the national interests of our states, the interest of maintaining security on the Eurasian continent.
Lavrov also outlined Russia was ready to support New Delhi in producing military products within the framework of the Make in India initiative. There is a synergy between Russia's pivot towards the East and India's own flagship initiatives such as Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India.
For more on this, we're now being joined by Principal Diplomatic Correspondent Siddhant Sibal. Siddhant, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Russian President Vladimir Putin has extended an invitation to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But let's talk about the meeting. What are the key highlights that you would say came out of this meeting?
Well, the fact that the Russian president has met the foreign minister is significant enough because remember that the Russian president usually do not hold a ministerial meeting, and earlier this year we saw he meeting the Indian NSA as well. He has made such exception only for the Chinese defense minister and for the foreign minister. Now coming to the moot point areas which were points of discussion, which includes the invitation as you have talked about, energy, trade, nuclear power, which was mentioned by the Indian External Affairs Minister, and of course the Ukraine conflict. Now, in terms of the Ukraine conflict, remember it was the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the sidelines of the Samarkand SCO summit last year saying this to the Russian president that this is not an era of war, and since then this has been one of the key focus area for Indian foreign policy in terms of how it looks at the Ukraine conflict. But essentially, all in all, this is the high point of this 5-day visit of the Indian External Affairs Minister, where the focus essentially from New Delhi is to bolster relationship, which is time-tested one with Moscow.
Siddhant, I just want to go back to what you initially mentioned, and this is something Hema and I were also discussing here in the newsroom. The fact that the Russian president met with the Indian External Affairs Minister. Now, that is something which you do not see happening regularly. Talk to us about the significance of that.
Well, yes, as I pointed out, that usually the Russian president do not hold any meeting with the incoming ministers, whether it's foreign minister or any other minister. He's made this exception only for the Indians and the Chinese, and that shows how Moscow is reaching out to, of course, India and China. But essentially talking about India-Russia relationship, as we have seen the Indian External Affairs Minister pointing out that how this relationship is constant and both are reliant on each other. But the message from his various conversations, public conversations, whether it's at the diaspora, whether it's standing alongside the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, or whether it is holding talks with the Russian president, has been essentially how India and Russia relationship have several convergences, and these convergences are bound to grow. Now, the visit of the Indian Prime Minister, their public invitation being extended, is one of the big stories. And remember, next year Russia will be the chair of the BRICS grouping from 1st of January, just few days from now, and it will be holding the summit in Kazan. Now, it's given that the Indian Prime Minister will be traveling, and that will be an occasion to hold much more in-depth conversation. We must also remember and recall that for last 2 years there hasn't been any India-Russia annual summit, and this is something that the Indian External Affairs Minister publicly talked about during his conversation with the Russian Foreign Minister, saying that next year it will happen.
So, of course, 2024 definitely will be a year where we'll see more interaction between India and Russian leadership, and, of course, both nations go to polls as well. Siddhant, thank you so much for joining in. We'll stay in touch for more updates.